Hey, I'm Sam Pressler.
And I'm PJ Walsh. Welcome to the In Stitches podcast, where we explore humanity and humor.
Today we have Dr. Janelle Junkin. She is a good friend of mine. We partnered together really closely on the research projects that we did at the Armed Services Arts Partnership. And I was excited to invite her to this podcast because from our work together, I saw how she has had experience engaging in some of the most difficult places, from post-genocide Africa to, on the lighter side, working as a music therapist with folks in hospice.
That's her light work.
And that's her light work. And she also had the experience working with us at ASAP to understand from a research angle, from an academic angle, the way that humor provides positive benefits and humor's limitations.
She's an incredible person. Now she's basically someone who's just brings humanity to people who are written off. It's an incredible it's an incredible journey.
Yeah. So really excited to have Dr. Janelle Junkin, not a medical doctor, a PhD, on the In Stitches podcast. Dr. Janelle Junkin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
You've worked with survivors of genocide and war. You've worked to support refugees integration. You work as a music therapist for children in hospice.
Yeah.
I have to take a deep breath just reading that. From an outsider's perspective, it's like you really like to just get into the heaviest possible shit. Like that is Janelle's line of work. Can you just talk to us a little bit about how you kind of continue to go down that path into that work?
Yeah. So one of the things is I only go where I'm invited. And so that was a decision that I made pretty early on, especially as a white American. I just wanted to be aware of that. And so I only go into communities who have invited me in. And because of that, I'm open to going and to being involved in work wherever. I don't have a lot of fear, which is probably a part of everything. I'm not afraid of what could happen to me in situations, if I travel to different countries and things like that. I think it's just like I'm open to it. I have connections and friends all over the world. And I think it's two ways for me, right? I value being able to bring the expertise and the knowledge and the skills that I have, but I also value being able to learn from others in what expertise and skills that they have. So I view the work that I do as more of an exchange, that I am learning just as much as I'm giving. And that's really important to me. And I think that comes across in the work that I do. But I'm drawn to the more crisis type of areas, and so I'm more willing to pursue opportunities to be a part of recovery, or being able just to bear witness to somebody else's struggle.
Can you walk me through what the process of the day of a music therapist is? Because I've heard music therapy, but for someone who's listening, who's like, oh, I have no idea what that entails.
Yes. So I can tell you what my personal experience has been, for sure. And there are a lot of different ways that music therapy can exist. I also should disclose that for me personally, I practice community music therapy. So it's a slightly different approach at times than maybe someone who would have a typical 9 to 5. I'm hired as a music therapist.
I used to perform community comedy, but now it's limited to my living room.
As we all are.
That's funny. So Janelle, maybe even just starting by defining what music therapy is. I know we have a lot of confusion around that, and that would be
Sure. Yeah. So music therapy is an evidence-based approach to therapy that can be individual or group level. And so it's using music as a way to meet therapeutic goals, right? So if I were treating somebody who had depression and I, as a music therapist, then, I'm going to talk about how we're going to, move through the depression using music as the tool to move us through that, right? So music is the way that I intervene. And so what it doesn't require is you don't have to know how to play an instrument or sing at all. It doesn't matter if you can carry a tune. None of that matters to a music therapist. That's not the point. We're not there to teach you how to play an instrument or, to be the best singer or songwriter or anything like that. But it's really using music as a way to facilitate health and healing growth. So music therapists, if they're working in like a psych hospital, you would see like on any given day when I did that. For me, I was actually part of an entire creative arts and therapy team. So there was a music therapist, art, and a dance movement therapist, and we co-treated and worked together. For instance, and in a psych hospital, I would have people with all different diagnoses happening, right? And so they might have schizophrenia or bipolar or depression, maybe eating disorders. It just depended on what was happening that brought them into the facility. And so like I might have people with all different backgrounds and diagnoses in one group. And so for me, oftentimes when I was working with that type of setting, I was really focused on how do I help build community and kind of awareness of each other, or at the very least, just an awareness of like the fact that like you are contributing to something a little bit larger.
Yeah.
Or the other work I've done is with Easter seals with special needs kids. And so that particular site, I was running literally back-to-back groups every day with kids with different diagnoses and different medical needs. So some had one-to-one nurses. Some were on, had tracheotomies. Some of them had feeding tubes. And then I was, again, part of a team of like physical therapists, occupational therapists, and speech therapists. And so really using music as a way to kind of get to some of like the developmental goals that kids needed, because this was a special school for kids who needed those extra developmental supports. And so that one, I would plan like a 30-minute session where we would have like a hello song and then maybe a movement song and then a callback song. So not all of my kids could speak. And so they have these thing called Big Mac switches, and I could record what I wanted them to say. And then hopefully with them, helping them get to the intentionality. So it was a couple of things, right? They could sing with me by hitting the Big Mac switch. It was working on that gross motor movement of knowing that, of being able to actually move their hand and arm to hit the switch. And then there was the idea of like also including that intentionality. So them knowing cognitively that as they were hitting the switch, it was because they were filling in a space for part of the song to move forward, right? And so there were multiple things that could happen in that one song. Right? And so you'd go through different things like that. And then, the goodbye songs, that would be like a typical session. And then when I was working as an outpatient therapist in an area in North Philadelphia, I was primarily doing individual therapy with teenagers and kids like 5 to 18 roughly. And then sometimes I was doing family therapy as well, depending on what was happening. So I had a lot of foster care kids, kids who were court ordered to be there, which was always a fun experience. But yeah, so it's this idea of like, how do you're using the music as a way to help people move towards whatever it is that their goal is. And so for me personally, I follow person-centered therapy. So I believe that people have what they need inside of them. And so like my role as a therapist is to help them find that, facilitate it, grow it. So because they have what they need, and I'm just there to help them discover that.
I'm interested in like where you got started. So can you just tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, and we can kind of go from there.
The first 7 years of my life, I lived in different parts of the country, and I was born overseas. The history is my dad was in the Air Force. I was actually born in Germany, and my brother was also born there, and we're actually only 13 months apart. And he was real sick as a kid, and so when my brother was in the hospital and my parents were with him, I was actually at the neighbor's house, and the neighbors who lived downstairs from us were from Mexico. And so they spoke Spanish to me. So I would sometimes ask for things in Spanish from my mom, who would then have to call the neighbors and ask them what I was asking for because she didn't know. That was the first 3 years of my life, was living in Germany, speaking English at home, but also being exposed to Spanish and to food from Mexico. And then we relocated back to the US. We were in a base in Massachusetts, and then we were actually back in Connecticut, and then Ohio. And then my parents got divorced. We moved back to Connecticut moving with my mom's parents, which is where I spent the rest of my life. So I would say that has probably colored a lot of who I am and how I view and interact in the world. In high school, what really got me into this is I'm actually a Hobie, which is a Hugh O'Brien Youth Foundation scholar. I was part of a group of teenagers and young people who traveled to Malaysia, Indonesia, China, and Hong Kong. And we spent time traveling around and seeing the different parts of the countries we were in. But the main point we were over there is actually to visit sweatshops. And so we actually toured different sweatshops and spoke to the higher ups and questioned them, and had opportunities to just kind of see up close, like the life that I live here in the United States was made possible because other people were oppressed around the world. And so that I saw and experienced in a very real way at 16. And that changed everything for me.
That's awesome.
And then, so part of like how I handled my parents' divorce was I got into music. I'm a flautist by training, actually.
PJ
and
is too.
So is he?
No.
Yeah. No, sorry. You don't know what you're missing, friend.
People like to claim it in my Navy years.
Nice. I started playing when I was 9, and then I actually was performing in front of audiences by the time I was 12 and competing pretty quickly. And I was being groomed to be a performer, but I didn't love the performing aspect of it. And I definitely I didn't want to be a teacher. So I didn't know what I could do with music. And so I spoke with my band director at the time, and I had asked him, what else can you do as a musician? And he said, well, there's actually music. There's this thing called music therapy. You should check it out. And the tragic part of that story, I guess I'll share it. Mr. Peters was like a surrogate father. When I was 17, he fell down a flight of stairs at his house and he broke his neck and he died. And I was sitting in trigonometry when they made the announcement to the student body. So after that happened, part of my grief process was actually, how can I bring like honor to his memory and the role that he played in me being like the person and musician that I was at that time. I pursued the music therapy and actually ended up finding out that there were 2 music therapists in my city. For my senior project, I was able to actually shadow them. And they worked with kids who were in the school system who had like autism or Down syndrome or cerebral palsy. But I also got an opportunity to see kids who were in a group home. They weren't what's called actively dying, but they had a shortened lifespan. So most kids weren't going to live past the age of 13, 14, 15. Mm-hmm. Probably the one who made the biggest impact on me, she passed probably about a year or 2 after I met her. But she was maybe 10, I think, but she was about the size of a 6-month-old baby. But her head was the size of like a 10-year-old child. So I know it's bizarre to describe, but if you can think like head and body were almost identical in size, but she could shake the shakers and she just like lit up when the music therapist came in and when there was music happening. And so I just kind of got to see, kids who were forgotten in our society or maybe pushed to the side, or might say like, well, do they really have any quality of life? But then really getting to see how music would bring something out of them. Yeah. And I was like, this is what I want to do. I want to be able to have people, and children especially, like have the opportunity to just be people.
That's awesome. If we take a step back, I think something that's so core to that story is just like this clear sense of altruism that you had from a really, really young age. Where do you think that came from?
When my parents divorced, it was actually fairly ugly. And so one of the things that I have just been aware of and had to come to peace out with for myself is that my dad didn't want to be our dad. Mm-hmm. And so as a kid, I internalized that of like, I'm disposable as a person. Right. And so that's something that I've always kind of like worked through and gone through my own therapy actually for myself. And so I think for me, that's not true. I'm not disposable, and neither are other people. And so I think how I ended up handling that was like, no, I don't want anybody else to feel this way ever. And so like, what can I do to help counter that?
And that's something that I know working with you, Janelle, that was so clear that it's not just in your therapy, but it translates to how you think about research, how you do everything. And I think what led to so much success and effectiveness of our research together was like that approach that it's not coming from a place of deficit, it's coming from a place of strength. Mm-hmm. And that very much is how the veteran military community often views themselves, not victims, but rather people who can contribute, people who have a sense of purpose.
Right.
And so it's interesting to hear you say that and kind of connect that to the through line within the research. That's really fascinating.
That's probably the common thread. Sorry. Now that you said that, that probably is the common thread to the work that I do, no matter what community, right? So, and as a community music therapist, I bring a level of skill and expertise and knowledge, but that doesn't mean that I am the expert or knowledgeable about the community or the people that I'm working with. It means that I'm bringing my own expertise and skill and knowledge, but you are the expert and you have the knowledge and you have the skill about who you are and who your community is. And so how can we now work together to do whatever it is that you're wanting to do next? And you're right. So that exists as my music therapy practice, but it also exists very much in how I approach all of my research. Yeah, that's true.
I do want to kind of close the loop a little bit on this intense work that you do and this work with, this work with affected populations, whether that's through research or music therapy. And for you, how do you cope? Like, what do you do? Because you're taking so much in. I know with ASAP, like I needed an outlet because even if I wasn't the caregiver, I was experiencing vicarious traumatization. It's like, how do you stay level? How do you cope with this day to day?
I guess it varies. And I will say, so I do have some of my better days. I will say, most recently, I thought I was doing fine with everything, and it turns out I wasn't because I was having an argument with the squirrel outside of my house. Literally, I had climbed onto the windowsill and was leaning out the window and yelling at the squirrel who was trying to get at this pizza box that was inside my container. So, so some days
you're saying that's not a positive coping mechanism?
I'm saying when you're arguing with a squirrel outside, you should probably take stock that maybe you're not okay. So it varies. And so that's a funny story, but I will give a more serious one that led me to really know that sometimes I don't pay attention to my limitations around that. So I had been doing outpatient therapy 2007, I think. And I had a young girl who had been, unfortunately, she'd been gang raped and knew who had done it, but wouldn't name the people for fear of retribution, but had come into my office. And so like, there's all of these legal things that have to happen, when that goes through. And unfortunately, it's this like terrible situation where someone's been a victim of something, and then like the system re-victimizes them because we take more choices away from them, right? Mm-hmm. So legally, there were steps that had to be followed, and so I had stepped out of my office, but I had the door open, and I don't know what made me turn back around. But anyways, I did, and I saw that she had picked up. I had a ballpoint pen on my desk, and she had picked that up and had attempted to shove that through her wrist. And so I got back in the room and, did what needed to be done. And we got her the care that she needed. And my staff, the staff at the facility was great. Like we talked about it. We debriefed about everything. Everybody checked in on me. I thought I was doing fine. I wasn't pretending that I wasn't upset. I had been crying after everything was all over. And so I'd gone home and I was like, okay, well, I'm going to make a pot of tea. And I actually want to experience like hearing the water boil and dropping the tea bags in and smelling that whole thing. So I put a pot of water on my stove. I walked into my living room and I sat down, and I didn't turn on the TV or music or anything. I just sat down in my living room and I just stared at the wall in my house. And 2 hours later, I became aware of the fact that my house was filling with smoke. And I had actually burned the bottom of the pot off of the pot and had caused a fire in my kitchen. So I wasn't okay, right? Mm-hmm. I was not okay dealing with all of that. And that had, this thing that happened had unfortunately been the top of everything of a series of things that had been going on with a lot of my clients, unfortunately, who are just in a lot of crisis. for me at that moment, I immediately was like, oh, I thought I was okay. I thought I was dealing with this. And like, I am not okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I ended up calling other therapists that I know. I got my own therapist to talk through and deal with things. And then I realized for me personally, like I couldn't continue to work in everyday high crisis areas where I was working with kids and families who like they maybe had a reprieve coming into my office, but I was then sending them right back out into an unchanged environment and social system that was going to continue to perpetuate these crises. For me personally, I couldn't continue in that work. And so that's where I switched, in which I realized when I sneak this next statement, it sound funny to people. That's where I switched working with Easter seals and with kids with special needs and kids who might have shortened lifespans. So that's what I did. And then, the next cycle up from there was I realized after doing that for a couple of years that like I was burning out as well. Especially I had a situation where I'd actually had 8 kids die like within 1 year. And just, that's a lot. And so I was like, I need to work with kids who are not going to die. And so I actually ended up nannying for a little bit to give myself a break and to do those other things. So for me, I have to like check in and see like, oh, do I need to stop doing something? Do I need to do something differently, different for a little bit? And then personally, so I'm a flautist by training, and I will say that's the one instrument I will not use with my clients. I keep that for me because music becomes about my clients. I might hear a song on the radio and I'm like, oh, I'm not thinking about maybe what that's saying for me. I'm thinking of like, oh, these lyrics are really good. I might use this with a client to kind of get at what they're experiencing, right? Mm-hmm. Keeping my flute separate and not using it for therapy was one of the ways that I managed my own sanity and kind of having a way for me to continue to express musically what I was experiencing.
I hear a lot in there, but I mean, the one thing or two things that are strong for me is that even professionals have challenges dealing with this.
Yeah.
And something I know that was super important, but is so hard when you're working with affected communities, is being able to set up boundaries. How do you just put some boundaries, some containers around what you're doing? Because otherwise the need is so great. The need never stops. It will consume your entire life.
Yep. Yeah. And right. And so sometimes saying like, oh, I'm not going to engage with this.
Mm-hmm. And it's almost being comfortable. Like for one of the things that I finally got to, but it was really hard, was being comfortable. Like I can do everything in my power, in my organization's power, and someone still might die.
Yep.
And how do I come to the acceptance of that without holding on to the guilt of the what ifs? What could I have done? And I'm grateful that I was able to like have that experience young, because and I think veterans that I've worked with have had this from a different angle, but like coming to terms with like the randomness of death and like not having it in your control, and being able to accept that, like that's the only way I was able to power forward with it in my own life.
Yeah. And, I will say like my closest inner circle of friends, don't take my shit, right? And they don't let me be too serious about myself. And those are the voices that I value the most, right? And so it's not that they are poo-pooing or minimizing what I'm experiencing or what I'm hearing or anything like that, but it's this constant call for me to be like, okay, and let's have a reality check against that. And this isn't about you. And there are other things that are going on. And, oh, right, you don't actually have the power to control any of this, so you should probably step back. So I think that helps.
And I would ask, like, and what role does humor play when your friends come in? Like, are there any particular like humorous or funny experiences that you could think of when they've come in and just like cut the shit?
Yeah. So I'm just thinking, my one friend Stephanie, she's one of the few people in my life who calls me Jay on the regular. Like I'll say something or get over on something, and she'll just say like, "Okay, Jay." And it's just kind of like deadpan of like, all right, you're taking yourself a little bit too seriously. And then we just like crack up. We just think that because I know what she's saying without saying it because they can hear it in her tone of voice. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's that mocking that my closest friends know how to mock me in a way that like I don't love in the moment, but like I get why they're doing it, and it actually is the way forward. Mm-hmm. And so they'll kind of like mock me for it, and it's usually like tone of voice, and sometimes it can be like a couple of words.
And it's just it's that release valve, right? It's just it's like go, oh yeah, you're right. All right.
Yeah, right, exactly. It's like I don't like the fact that you're right. And I get that you're right. And like, okay, I'm checking myself. Let's move on. You know? Yeah.
Friends do that. Friends have that. I call it like the quicksand technique. Like they hit you with something and you're like, ugh.
Yeah.
And a couple of days later, it kind of sinks in. You're like, all right. I wasn't ready, but okay. I got it's sunk in. I got you.
Yeah. That right there. You know, I mean, and sometimes I need a release valve to just be ridiculous. And so, you know, like I'll play Cards Against Humanity. And I think it is hilarious when we're totally out of control. And that's where I can go towards like the darker side of humor. I would never do that in my professional life, but, you know, just to have that break.
There's no way that working in that space can affect you. There's no way it's just, as it's coming, there's no way it's not gonna. It's like the Grand Canyon. You know, it keeps over time. It just keeps going and going and going. And at a certain point, you got to step back. At a certain point, you're gonna blow up. You have to have a release. I mean, I've had that with myself working with veterans and doing a comparison game with myself, saying, "Now I can't complain. Who am I to complain?" So I'm taking this call or I'm taking these trips, and you know, then things start adding up. And one trip when I was overseas, we entertained about 100 soldiers, and the next day we find out most of them died. You know, and that reality comes in, and that was the next morning. We're there to make you laugh. So all these things start layering in. It's going to get you. Like I didn't have the education to step back or whatever. I could pretty much, you know, had to have my friends step in and go, "Yo, dude, you gotta really, you know, think about yourself here for a second." And Sam and I have had these conversations because he shoulders a lot. You know, he created a program where a lot of people, he sees a lot of changes, there's a lot of pain. So, and friends are so vital in that, like to have that circle.
Yeah.
And when you're in there, you're going to be dark. Sometimes I say this, I'm like, I don't think we're like normal people.
You know? I mean, we hear this a lot though. It's like being able to take that darkness and turn it into something funny or humorous actually gives you agency and ownership over that story.
Right.
I mean, I've heard that so many times with the veterans in our program. When I could take getting shot 5 times and this thing that's supposed to be traumatic and this thing that you're going to feel bad for me about, and I could go on stage and I can make you laugh about that. Now I own that experience.
Right.
So this is actually a good segue point. Tell us about your research in the community arts, maybe with a particular lens around play and your research on humor.
For me, finding a way to be able to say like, no, this is my story and I'm going to tell it the way that I'm going to tell it. And I'm going to invite you into it. That made a lot of sense to me. Again, like that paralleled a lot of the work that I had done prior. And then just seeing the importance and from a neuroscience perspective, just being able to say like, oh, right, like the brain, the body, we need opportunities and places to kind of breathe and to relax and to rest. And humor and creativity and the arts, you know, bring that and allow that aspect for people. And how fantastic is it that there's this organization who does this for veterans and friends and family and caregivers of veterans to be able to say like, yeah, these things happened in your life and they don't have to define who you are, but they can define how you move forward. And then how you do that is how you kind of process that. And so that all made sense to me. And it felt like I was just continuing to work on one larger thing. I will say that one of the interesting results of the humor thing is I'm much more aware of, like, I never really thought of self-deprecating humor as being like a negative thing or self-defeating humor until we got into this research project and we're really talking about like positive versus negative humor styles.
And can you just explain what those are really quickly for folks listening?
Oh, yeah. So sure. There's 4 and there's the self-enhancing. And so that's right. So I'm using humor as a way to kind of lift myself up and kind of tell my story in a different way. There's the affiliative. And so that's where I'm using it as a way to maybe connect with myself and with others. There's the aggressive, and then there's the self-defeating where you're really just, it's just this constant kind of like making fun of yourself, which is funny at times. Like there's a place for that, but when it becomes like this, like that's all that you're able to do, then it goes into like some more negative things in terms of psychology and stuff like that. So I'm much more aware of those and how they can play out. And so I teach public speaking at Harrisburg University of Science and Technology in the Philadelphia campus. And I had a student, he's quite funny naturally. And so he kept saying to me, I want to use humor in my speeches. And I said, okay, well, that's fine. There's ways that we can build that in and we can do it and that's hopefully effective rather than just kind of, I don't want the students to just laugh at you, right? And I realized really quickly, and I think I was more keyed into it because of the work I had done with ASAP, that he was actually leaning on the self-defeating humor and wasn't moving anywhere off of that. And I let that happen. I let it happen for about 2 speeches because I wanted to see if it was a pattern or a fluke and then after the second time, I ended up pulling him aside and I said, hey, I actually see what you're doing. I understand why you're doing it, but like I don't want you to use that anymore. I want you to try a different way to bring humor into what you're talking about.
It's really cool.
Yeah. And so he did. And we worked with that over the semester and he just turned in his final and it's really well done. And it's not saying that he won't continue to use self-defeating humor, but it was interesting to be able to address that in a classroom setting pretty quickly to recognize it. And I would say, honestly, I only picked up on it that fast because of the work that I had done with ASAP. So I'm realizing that question, when you post it, made me realize that I'm more aware of that in different ways now than I had been prior.
What's interesting about that is as a comedian, you're kind of always on. You always have this recorder happening. You're always paying attention, like this comedy eye that's happening. And if you're punching down and the subject that you're hitting all the time is yourself, it's much like we talked about earlier, where it's gonna start chipping away at you. And that affects everything. There has to be a bit of a balance, to kind of like even it out.
It's really interesting, and because we had these elements of our comedy bootcamp program that we didn't understand, frankly, the humor styles before we started. But as we were teaching comedy bootcamp, we accentuated the positive humor styles, and we actually pushed people away from the negative humor styles. So we were always focused on getting on stage and giving yourself the win. Like we always used to say with feedback, if like we were feeling down about how people ended their set, like the audience wants you to get the win. Like, how do we have you tell the story so you get the win? And that was a self-enhancing humor style in retrospect, right? When people would punch down, like when we had guys make fun of women, and if that was just a joke, we would always say, no one wants to hear you make fun of someone who is like perceived as lower than you, right? And like they would get that feedback naturally from the class in that group-based environment. And what was happening was we were pushing away against the self-defeating styles. We were pushing towards the self-enhancing styles. And because of the group-based environment, we were actually facilitating an affiliative humor environment to have those affiliative humor styles. And so it's just so interesting now, like we kind of peel back the onion on this humor research. There's something about humor research that like almost takes the joy and surprise out of humor.
Yeah.
There's this innate intelligence that we have around how could humor be healthy and how could humor be harmful? And it does bring me to another question for you, Janelle. What is humor at its best? And like, what do you see humor at its worst?
When I think about humor at its best, I view it as a way to help process or name or bring awareness to something that's going on either in the personal life or maybe in societal, something. And to be able to say like, oh, I don't have any control over all of this. And I'm just going to like, this is what it is. Right. And so like, I would say like, that's some of the things that I look for when I see like quality type of humor. And so even if it dips into self-defeating, because sometimes it can, and to be totally honest, I think there's a place for that at times, right? I think there are places to have self-defeating humor. I think from a psychological standpoint, it's when I see that as like the only place that we go to, or it's used as a way to avoid dealing with other things. So I'm just going to focus on this. It's like, and you hear like comedians talk about the low hanging fruit. I think like that self-defeating humor can be like that low-hanging fruit of like, I don't want to deal with these other things, so I'm just going to stick right here. And so like, I would say it's the use of all of them, right? Your self-enhancing, your affiliative, your aggressive, and your self-defeating, and knowing kind of when to bring those out and when not to. I think that's probably the healthiest that I would say. It's when you get stuck in one and you're unable to kind of maneuver through the others that I think that's when I would start to be like, ooh, I think something's going on here.
We're talking in the middle of, most of us are on lockdown with coronavirus.
Right.
And I think a lot about how people like went to Netflix and like went to Tiger King when this first started. And that was an avoidance tactic. That was escape. That was avoidance. And we've talked about that was adaptive in the moment, like to just get away from the reality and the uncertainty and the fear. Like you could take your mind off of it.
Yeah.
But when that lasts over time, right? That's when it gets.
Right. Yep. Right. When you get stuck in that and then all you are doing is avoiding and like, I'm going to do everything I can to avoid dealing with whatever it is. Then that's when it becomes maladaptive. Right? And that's when it's like, okay, there's now we've got some problems. Right.
I want the guy who's stuck in humor to talk.
I love the way that you guys are breaking down humor. To me, as a professional comedian, what I always looked at comedy and basically what a laugh is it's just a surprise recognition that we're not alone. So when you get a really, really good laugh and everyone leans in, and
right.
And to go into the studying of comedy, to think about studying comedy, I hate to give this quote to somebody, but years ago, I heard Mel Gibson talk about filmmaking. All right. I hate to say about filmmaking. I'm bringing up all the bad stuff, but but he was talking about filmmaking and he goes, I can't enjoy a film anymore because I know all the tricks, and he's like, so if I see something that I don't know, I just pick up the phone and I call somebody. People aren't taking those calls now, really. But back then, like, and I was just like, wow, you get that with comedy. And this is where I'm very appreciative of Sam's friendship and what he created, because for somebody like me who's like down the road and I've been doing comedy for a while, it's one of these things where I get to see the excitement. I get to see the community. I get to see the breakdown and practice of comedy and the tools of it that I just kind of let go. And then what you're doing is, when I started comedy, when I was really, really hungry, we used to do shows at hospitals in cancer wings for kids, and I would go and do them because I just wanted stage time. And like, when I'm listening to your story and everything that you do, I'm sitting here going, I'm more qualified to do those shows now, and I'm not doing them, So yeah. That's what I get to appreciate about what we're creating here and getting to talk to somebody like both of you, where it goes, okay, it makes me look back and go, okay, look, there's other things you can do with this craft that I've created, and to see what you're doing with music in that same place. It's very, very interesting to me. Now, if you're somebody like from the working class, or somebody who's like a plumber or electrician or something like that, and we have all these programs, can you sum up why it's important for them to contribute to something like that when all of a sudden they can go down to a food bank? Is there a way short that goes, this is why this is vital? Is there in all your research, narrowed it down to like a pitch of like, this is why the arts is important to contribute and to keep going?
Yeah, and I would expand on that to say, for both plumbers and people of all walks of life.
I was really talking about my dad's a plumber. What?
I thought you were doing like a John McCain, like Joe the plumber thing.
Oh, no. That's why I ended up a field medic and a dental technician in the Navy, because the other job they offered me was hull technician. I said, what's a hull technician? They said, it's a plumber. I said, my grandfather's a plumber, my uncle's a plumber, my dad's a plumber. I'll go to teeth.
That's awesome.
I know it's a big question. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Yeah, and I'm gonna broaden it to just like the act of creating.
Mm-hmm.
So engaging in the act of creating is as necessary to your body as eating, to sleeping, to meeting your basic needs. It is a basic need.
That's great.
I love it.
Yeah, I think that's awesome.
So I think we can get to our closing question that I've enjoyed asking so far on my one podcast that I've done.
Okay.
You've done all this work How do you want to be remembered?
Yeah, it's funny. I have been this question has haunted me a little bit because I would say my first gut response is I have no idea. I've never actually really thought about it.
Mm.
But having thought about it some, she saw, she cared.
Wow. Damn.
It's a showstopper.
Yeah. Man.
Oh. Whew.
We're going to have to change the last question, Sam. She just freaking slam dunked that son of a bitch.
Oh my God.
Damn.
All right.
Hey,
The other thing I could say.
No. Edit.
Well, you close with the strongest line.
That was super, super powerful. That was awesome.
Dr. Janelle Junkin, thank you so much for joining the In Stitches podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This was fantastic.
Man, just fascinating. It's fascinating the number of avenues and projects she's thrown herself into selflessly. And then also eye-opening to me, and which I find incredibly interesting, is how qualified she is, but how she says she can only come in and complement. She can bring all these skills in, but it's the community, they work together. Because there's so many people who are experts who are like, I got all the answers. And she's just like, no, I've got skills and we're going to work on the answer together. That blew me away.
Yeah. I think there's a wisdom in that, in understanding that like people already have what they need. How can I just play a role in facilitating it or accentuating it or bringing it out further? And I think what's more impressive is her, or not, but differently impressive is her naming the boundaries and her limitations and recognizing that she cannot give infinitely, or else that could start to hurt herself. And actually being so vulnerable with us about, hey, like, this is when I've gone too far. This is how I've realized I've gone too far. And this is how I've dialed it back. And like, even me as a practitioner, someone who has, a background in kind of both clinical and community mental health work, I need to take time for myself. I need to draw those boundaries. And for me, that's the lesson learned, is like, if she can do that in the intensity of her work, if she can make sure that she has separation for other folks who are giving so much, you can do that too. Well, we couldn't have done our second episode of In Stitches if it were not for, again, our amazing guest, Dr. Janelle Junkin. So Janelle, thank you for joining us, for sharing so openly, for teaching us a few things new. And this wouldn't have happened without our incredible executive producer, David Bobber, who's really sees all these episodes through from start to finish. So thank you, David.
That's the end of episode number 2, Sam.
Right? Hopefully it's not the last one.
I don't think so.
Sorry,
I hope not.
I don't know why I responded that way.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody else. Thank you, everybody that's listening. Do us all a favor. Follow us on all the In Stitches social media platforms. We're on everything. We're on Facebook. We're on Instagram. We're on Friendster. And do us a favor. Take this episode, share it, like it. Go to In Stitches and leave a comment. And please leave us a review. Thank you so much for listening.
This has been In Stitches.